chase him out. Beautiful play by Matt Janney, gets it away, and George Cullen is there. Janney, a Georgian sevens player, using a bit of skill.
This is me, playing rugby for the Georgian national sevens team in the summer of 2016. Growing up, I never imagined I'd play international rugby, and certainly not for Georgia. I was born in London and brought up as British. When I was 3, my dad died. His father had died when he was 5, so my grandfather remained a complete mystery to me. I was always told he had been Russian or Georgian or something, but it never went beyond that. Like a watermark in the corner of the page, the question of where I came from was always on my mind. I don't know what my grandfather's voice sounded like, whether it was high and hoarse or low and rumbling. I don't know how many languages he spoke, whether he listened to Bach or blues, or whether he slept well at night or stayed up smoking like those lonely men do in movies from the 50s.
And Barker gives it on to Janney.
We are now in 2013, and I was a student playing rugby at Oxford University in England. Russia's national rugby team came to play us. The game was fast, tight, physical. And talking to the coaches afterwards, I told them what I tell everyone, that my grandfather was Russian or Georgian or something. The coaches heard only the word Russia. They invited me to try out for the national team. For them, it was a chance to try new players ahead of the World Cup. And for me, a chance to fulfill a lifelong ambition, play international rugby. The Russia Rugby Union said they'd help me look into the archive and discover my ancestry. But the more we dug, the more it became clear I was definitely not Russian, and I was definitely Georgian. I found photos of my family. Here they are in Tbilisi at the end of the 19th century. I found out my original surname, Janashvili. I found out my grandfather had fled Tbilisi as a Georgian Jew ahead of the Bolshevik Revolution. He made a long journey to Britain with all the classic hallmarks of a 20th century story of migration and exile. False passports, name changes, financial strain, separation, reunion, death. And while there were missing details and untied ends, I could now say that he, and therefore I, was Georgian. At last, I had some clarity. So, I called the vice chairman of the Russia Rugby Union to break the news. I could no longer play for Russia. But the vice chairman had other ideas. "You're at Oxford," he said. "Can't you just get an Oxford historian to write a document saying that a Georgian born in your grandfather's time would have felt Russian?" I don't remember what I said in response. Maybe I mumbled something incoherent, or maybe I stayed silent, lost for words. On the surface, it was funny. But beneath it all, I felt nothing but discomfort. Here was Russia trying to fabricate history. Not just my own and my grandfather's, but the history of a people. Meanwhile, nearly 2,000 miles away on the Black Sea coast, Russian forces were annexing Crimea. Western media called it an unlawful land grab in response to the Maidan protests in Kiev. Others called it Russian imperialism, making a comeback after the collapse of the Soviet Union. How did Russia legitimize Crimea's annexation? By claiming that Crimeans would have felt Russian. When I tell this story to Georgians, they usually react pretty strongly. When I tell this story to Brits, they shrug and say, "That's just what happens. National teams slip in foreigners all the time, construing wild and wonderful ways to make players eligible." But this felt different. For me, it wasn't just about proving my eligibility, but claiming my identity. What the vice chairman said to me reflects a Russian mindset that sees its neighbors not as equal subjects, but countries to dominate. Around the time of my grandfather's birth, Georgia was under the control of the Russian Tsar. Georgians were minorities in their own home and would have felt even more pressure to preserve their heritage and identity. By asserting that my grandfather would have felt Russian, the Russians, were rewriting history. There is an old Soviet joke that says, "The future is certain. It is only the past that is unpredictable." But this flimsy relationship to the past allows disinformation to flourish, and with it, lives to be airbrushed out and stories to be forgotten. What happened to me is just a singular moment in a much bigger story. I often think of the thousands of Georgians who flooded Tbilisi streets in 1978, protesting the Soviet Union's decision to make Georgia's sole state language Russian. Or the man who went to bed in Georgia and woke up in Russian-occupied South Ossetia after Russian forces moved the border a mile inland. These instances have far more political significance and personal consequence than mine, but they are all linked to Russia's overreaching nationalism. In July 2015, I played my first ever game for the Georgian national sevens team at a tournament in the UK. I was officially a Georgian citizen. As we lined up against our opponent, studs anxiously clinked and clunked on the tunnel floor, and motivational cries in Georgian echoed off the walls. They were louder than usual. They were incandescent, because my first game for Georgia was against Russia. Thank you.